Imagine waking up more than 1,000 years ago. There are no skyscrapers outside your window, no cars moving through the streets, no electricity lighting the night, no phones, no televisions, and no sound of modern cities. Instead, you hear church bells in the distance, horses moving along a muddy road, wooden carts creaking beneath heavy loads, a blacksmith striking hot iron, and somewhere beyond the village, a stone castle rises above the hills. The air smells of smoke, wood, earth, and freshly baked bread. The sun slowly disappears behind the forest, and as darkness spreads across the medieval landscape, hundreds of tiny fires begin glowing beneath the night sky. This was Europe during the Middle Ages, an age of castles and kingdoms, knights and merchants, monasteries and villages, wars and festivals, but also an age of ordinary people simply trying to live their lives. For centuries, the medieval world existed between two enormous chapters of history. Behind it was the Roman Empire. Ahead would come the Renaissance, the age of exploration, and eventually the modern world. But how did Europe transform from the powerful Roman world into the strange and fascinating medieval world? To understand that, we have to travel back to the beginning, back to the moment when the Roman world began to break apart, the end of the Roman world. For hundreds of years, Rome had dominated much of Europe. Roman roads crossed enormous distances. Roman armies protected borders. Roman cities contained markets, public baths, temples, amphitheaters, and enormous buildings. The empire was one of the most sophisticated political systems the ancient world had ever seen. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, Rome was facing serious problems: political instability, economic difficulties, military pressure, and conflicts along its enormous borders. The empire had become incredibly large. Maintaining control over such a vast territory was difficult. Eventually, the Roman Empire became divided into eastern and western halves. The Eastern Roman Empire survived for many centuries. But in the West, Roman authority gradually weakened. Cities became smaller. Long-distance trade declined in some regions. Roman armies struggled to maintain the borders, and different Germanic kingdoms began establishing themselves inside former Roman territory. Then, in 476 CE, the Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus was removed from power. Historians traditionally use this event as a symbolic date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But the change wasn't sudden. Rome didn't simply disappear overnight. Instead, the transformation happened slowly. Decade after decade, the Roman world changed. And from this changing landscape, the medieval world began to emerge, a new Europe. Imagine standing in Europe during this transition. Some old Roman roads still exist. Some Roman buildings still stand. But the empire that built them is disappearing. New kingdoms are forming. Different languages are developing. Local rulers are gaining power. Christianity is spreading. And villages are becoming increasingly important. The world is becoming more local. Instead of one enormous empire controlling huge territories, Europe becomes a patchwork of kingdoms, lords, towns, villages, and independent communities. The Roman past hasn't completely disappeared. Its roads remain. Its laws influence later societies. Its language survives. Its cities continue to exist. But something new is emerging: the Middle Ages, life in a medieval village. For most people, medieval life wasn't lived inside castles. It was lived in villages. Imagine a small settlement surrounded by forests and farmland. There are perhaps a few dozen families. Houses are made from timber, mud, and thatch. Smoke rises from simple roofs. Nearby, fields stretch across the landscape. Farmers grow wheat, barley, peas, beans, and other crops. Animals live close to the homes. Chickens wander through the village. Pigs search for food. Cows and sheep are kept nearby. Life follows the rhythm of the seasons. Spring means planting. Summer means working beneath long hours of sunlight. Autumn means harvesting. Winter means surviving the cold and protecting whatever food has been stored. For most people, the calendar is not controlled by smartphones or clocks. It is controlled by the sun, the seasons, religious festivals, and the agricultural cycle, the medieval night. And then night arrives. Without electric lights, darkness is much more complete. Inside a small medieval home, a fire provides warmth. A candle or oil lamp provides a weak glow. The family gathers close together. Outside, the village becomes quiet. The sounds of animals gradually disappear. The wind moves through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a watchman may be guarding the settlement. Far away, a church bell marks the passing hours. Above everything, the night sky is enormous. Without modern light pollution, the Milky Way would appear far brighter than it does in most cities today. Thousands of stars would fill the sky. For medieval people, the heavens were not simply beautiful. They were part of their understanding of the world. The stars helped mark seasons. Religious traditions connected heaven and earth, and many people believed the universe was filled with divine meaning. The rise of castles. As kingdoms developed, another structure became increasingly important: the castle. At first, many medieval fortifications were simple wooden structures surrounded by earthworks. But over time, stone castles became symbols of power. Imagine approaching a medieval castle for the first time. A huge stone wall rises before you. Towers stand above the landscape. A deep ditch surrounds the fortress. A heavy wooden gate controls the entrance. Above the walls, guards watch the road. Inside, there are workshops, kitchens, stables, storage rooms, living quarters, and sometimes a grand hall. The castle isn't simply a home. It is a military fortress, a political center, and a symbol of authority. And the higher the walls rise, the more powerful the lord appears. The people inside the castle. But castle life wasn't all knights and royal banquets. A castle was like a small town. Someone had to cook. Someone had to clean. Someone had to repair clothing. Someone had to care for horses. Someone had to maintain weapons. Someone had to store food. Someone had to keep the fire burning. Someone had to bring water. And someone had to organize all of it. A medieval castle could contain dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people depending on its size and importance. At the center was often the Great Hall. This was where meals were eaten, meetings were held, visitors were welcomed, and important decisions were made. At night, the hall could become warm and crowded, lit by firelight and candles. Outside, the stone walls disappeared into darkness, the birth of a new society. As Europe changed, a new social structure gradually developed. Kings ruled kingdoms. Nobles controlled land. Knights served powerful lords. Farmers worked the fields. Merchants traveled between towns. Craftsmen produced tools, clothing, weapons, and everyday objects. Monks lived in monasteries, copying manuscripts, growing food, and preserving knowledge. Each group played a different role, and although medieval society was highly unequal, it was also deeply interconnected. A knight needed a blacksmith, a castle needed farmers, a town needed merchants, a monastery needed food, and everyone depended on the land, the world beyond the village. For many medieval people, the world could feel surprisingly small. A farmer might live most of his entire life within a few kilometers of his birthplace. Travel was difficult. Roads could be dangerous. Forests were vast. Bandits were a real concern. Crossing mountains could take weeks, but some people traveled enormous distances. Merchants carried goods between cities. Pilgrims traveled to religious sites. Soldiers crossed entire kingdoms. And sailors moved goods across seas. The medieval world was connected, but much more slowly than ours. A journey that today takes hours could take weeks. A message that today travels instantly could take months. And that meant news was powerful. A king could die, and people hundreds of kilometers away might not hear about it for weeks. The world is about to change. The Middle Ages would last for roughly 1,000 years. During that enormous period, Europe would experience extraordinary changes. Kingdoms would rise and disappear. Castles would become larger. Cities would grow. Trade would expand. Universities would appear. Explorers would travel farther. And terrible disasters would also strike. Wars, famines, and the Black Death would reshape entire societies. But before we reach those dramatic moments, we need to understand the people who lived at the center of medieval society. The farmers, the knights, the merchants, the monks, and the rulers. Because medieval Europe wasn't simply an age of castles. It was a world built around land. Who owned the land? Who worked it? Who protected it? And who had the right to rule? The answers created one of the most important systems of medieval Europe, feudal society. And that is where our journey truly begins. Before we imagine medieval kings, knights, and magnificent castles, we should first step into the world of ordinary people. Because most people in medieval Europe never lived inside a castle. They lived in villages, small communities surrounded by fields, forests, streams, and long stretches of countryside. And for these people, life followed a rhythm that had changed very little for generations. The seasons determined almost everything: when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for winter, and when to rest. The village. Imagine approaching a medieval village just after sunrise. A narrow dirt path leads between wooden houses. The roofs are covered with straw or reeds. Thin smoke rises from chimneys and openings in the roofs. Nearby, a few chickens search through the soil. Cattle are being led toward pasture. Children move between the houses. And somewhere in the distance, a bell begins to ring. The village is waking up. There are no paved streets, no streetlights, no traffic. The roads are simply packed earth, and after heavy rain, they can become deep mud. A village might contain several dozen families, although some settlements could become considerably larger. At the center might be a small church. Nearby could be a mill, a blacksmith's workshop, a communal oven, or a larger house belonging to the local lord or manor administrator. But the most important feature surrounds everything: the fields. The fields that fed everyone. Almost every part of medieval life depended on agriculture. Wheat, barley, oats, peas, beans, and vegetables formed much of the basic diet. Farmers worked with simple tools: wooden plows, iron-tipped tools, hoes, sickles, axes, and enormous amounts of human effort. A field that can be prepared quickly with modern machinery could require days or weeks of manual labor. Imagine standing in the middle of a field, holding a wooden-handled tool, with the morning sun slowly rising above the horizon. There is no tractor coming, no engine waiting nearby. The work depends on your hands, your animals, and the weather. The medieval farming year. The year was divided by agricultural tasks. Spring was one of the busiest periods. Fields had to be prepared, seeds had to be planted, animals had to be cared for. As summer arrived, crops grew. Farmers worked long days beneath the sun. Then came autumn, harvest time. This was perhaps the most important period of the entire year. If the harvest was good, the village had food for the winter. If the harvest failed, the consequences could be devastating. There was no supermarket nearby, no refrigerated warehouse, no modern food distribution network. A bad harvest could mean hunger, and repeated bad harvests could lead to famine. This made weather incredibly important. Rain, drought, cold, storms, and disease could change the fate of an entire community. Inside a medieval home. Now imagine entering one of the village houses. The interior is small and simple. The floor may be packed earth. The walls are made from timber, mud, clay, or a combination of materials. The roof is usually thatched. There may be only one main living space. A fire burns near the center. Smoke slowly escapes through an opening above. There is little furniture, a wooden table, a few stools, storage containers, simple beds or sleeping platforms, perhaps some woven baskets. At night, the entire family gathers around the fire. The flames provide warmth, light, and a place to cook. The house is not luxurious, but it is home. What did medieval people eat? The medieval diet depended heavily on social class and location. For ordinary villagers, bread was extremely important. Grain was ground into flour, then baked into loaves. Porridge was also common. Peas, beans, cabbage, onions, and other vegetables could provide important nutrition. Cheese and dairy products were valuable. Eggs were useful when available. Meat was eaten, but access varied greatly. Pork, chicken, and other meats could appear on the table. For wealthier households, the variety could be much greater. More meat, better quality bread, spices, imported foods, wine, and other luxury ingredients. But for many villagers, food was practical. The goal was simple: eat enough to continue working. Bread in the medieval mill. Turning grain into flour required enormous effort. Grinding grain by hand was exhausting. So watermills and windmills became increasingly important in medieval Europe. A watermill could use the power of flowing water to rotate enormous grinding stones. Instead of one person grinding grain for hours, the machinery could perform much of the repetitive work. The mill, therefore, became an important part of village life. Farmers brought grain. The miller processed it, and flour returned to the community. The mill itself could become economically important, and the miller could become one of the more recognizable figures in the village. Clothing. Medieval clothing was also practical. Ordinary people commonly wore garments made from wool or linen. Wool was especially useful in colder regions. It provided warmth and could withstand hard use. Clothing was valuable. A person didn't simply throw away an old shirt. Fabric could be repaired, patched, reused, and eventually transformed into something else. Wealthier people could afford finer materials, more elaborate colors, and more decorative clothing. Clothing, therefore, often revealed social status. A nobleman's clothing could look dramatically different from that of a farmer. But underneath the differences, everyone still had to deal with the same cold winters, rainy days, and muddy roads. Children in the medieval village. Children were part of village life from an early age. There was no modern concept of childhood in exactly the same form. Children gradually learned the skills they would need as adults. A child might help feed animals, collect firewood, carry water, watch younger siblings, or assist with farm work. As they grew older, their responsibilities increased. Boys might learn farming, craftsmanship, or another trade. Girls often learned household skills, food preparation, textile work, and other responsibilities. But these patterns varied greatly by region and social class. Some children entered apprenticeships. Others joined religious communities. The lives of children were shaped by their families, their local economy, and the opportunities around them. Marriage and family. Family was at the center of medieval society. Most households depended on cooperation. Farming required many hands. Food had to be prepared. Animals needed care. Clothing needed repair. Children needed supervision. The household was therefore both a family and an economic unit. Marriage could also involve economic considerations. Land, property, inheritance, and social connections mattered. For wealthy families, marriage could strengthen political alliances. For ordinary people, it could help create a stable household and working partnership. Love certainly existed, but medieval marriage was often connected to practical realities as well. The blacksmith. Every village needed tools, and tools needed someone to make them. That person was the blacksmith. Imagine approaching a small workshop. Inside, a fire glows intensely. The blacksmith heats a piece of iron until it becomes bright orange. Then, he places it on an anvil. Bang! The hammer strikes. Bang! Again. The shape slowly changes. A horseshoe, a knife, a farming tool, a nail, a metal fitting. The blacksmith's work touched almost every part of medieval life. A broken plow could threaten a harvest. A damaged horseshoe could affect transportation. A poorly made tool could waste hours of labor. So the blacksmith wasn't simply a craftsman. He was essential to the village economy. The church bell. As evening approaches, the village becomes quieter. Farmers return from the fields. Animals are brought back. Food is prepared. The blacksmith's fire begins to fade. Then, the church bell rings. For medieval people, bells were more than religious symbols. They helped organize time. They announced services. They marked important events. They could warn people of danger. And they provided a rhythm to village life. Without clocks in every home, the church became one of the community's most important markers of time. Night falls. The sun disappears. The fields become dark. The village slowly settles. Inside the houses, families gather around small fires. The light is weak. The shadows are deep. Outside, the roads are almost completely black. There are no streetlights stretching into the distance, only the occasional torch, candle, or fire. Above the rooftops, the stars become incredibly bright. The Milky Way stretches across the sky. For a modern person, it would feel almost unreal. And somewhere beyond the village, a stone castle watches over the countryside. Its lord controls the surrounding land. Farmers work that land. And in return, they owe duties, payments, or labor. This relationship forms one of the defining structures of medieval Europe, a system of land, loyalty, and obligation. As the evening darkness settles over the medieval village, high above the fields, a different world is beginning to quiet down. On a hill, surrounded by thick stone walls, stands the castle. From below, it looks enormous. Towers rise above the trees. A heavy gate closes the entrance. Torches flicker along the walls. And somewhere at the top, a watchman looks across the countryside. But the castle is more than a beautiful stone building. It represents power, land, protection, and a complicated system of relationships that shaped medieval Europe. This system is often called feudalism. The land was everything. In medieval Europe, wealth was closely connected to land. Land produced food. Land supported animals. Land provided timber. Land could contain valuable resources. And whoever controlled the land had enormous power. At the top of the political hierarchy was usually the king. But a medieval king could not personally manage every village, every field, and every castle across an entire kingdom. So land was granted to powerful nobles. These nobles controlled territories, collected revenues, and provided military support to the king. Below them, smaller landholders and knights controlled estates. And at the bottom, the majority of people worked the land. Farmers, peasants, craftsmen, and villagers. It was a system built around relationships. Land in exchange for service. Protection in exchange for obligations. Loyalty in exchange for rewards. The king. Imagine a medieval king sitting inside a great hall. The room is enormous. Wooden beams stretch overhead. Tapestries cover sections of the stone walls. A large fireplace burns at one end. Nobles stand nearby. Messengers arrive from distant parts of the kingdom. Documents are being prepared. Taxes are being discussed. Military problems are being reported. The king may be the most powerful person in the kingdom, but his power still depends on people. He needs nobles to support him. He needs soldiers to fight for him. He needs administrators to collect taxes. He needs farmers to produce food. He needs roads, castles, and loyal officials. A medieval kingdom is therefore not controlled by one person alone. It is an enormous network. The nobles. Below the king, powerful nobles controlled large territories. A noble might own several villages, fields, forests, mills, and a castle. The castle could serve as the administrative center of the estate. From there, officials could collect taxes, judges could settle disputes, supplies could be stored, and soldiers could be organized. The noble also had responsibilities. He was expected to provide military support to his king. If war came, he might have to bring knights and soldiers. If the kingdom was threatened, his castle could become a defensive stronghold. So land wasn't simply wealth. It came with obligations. The knight. And this brings us to one of the most famous figures of medieval Europe, the knight. Knights were mounted warriors. Their training could begin during childhood. A boy from a noble family might first serve as a page, learning household skills and basic discipline. Later, he could become a squire. A squire trained under an experienced knight. He learned how to ride, handle weapons, care for armor, and understand battlefield discipline. Eventually, if he demonstrated the necessary skill, he could be formally made a knight. But the romantic image of the knight, shining armor, perfect manners, and heroic adventures doesn't tell the entire story. Knights were trained for warfare, and medieval warfare could be brutal. Inside the castle. Let's return to the castle. Imagine walking through its enormous gate. The entrance is protected by thick wooden doors. Above you, a guard watches from the walls. Inside the outer courtyard, there are horses, workshops, storage buildings, and servants moving between different areas. A castle is not empty stone. It is alive. The stable is busy. Horses are being fed. Blacksmiths repair weapons. Kitchen workers prepare food. Carpenters repair wooden structures. Servants carry water. Guards patrol the walls. And somewhere inside, the Lord's household is preparing for the evening meal. The Great Hall. The center of castle life is often the Great Hall. This is where important people gather. Meals are served. Visitors are welcomed. Legal matters are discussed. Entertainment takes place. And political decisions are made. At the front, the Lord and his family sit at a raised table. Below them, other members of the household eat. The room is illuminated by fireplaces, candles, and torches. The walls are decorated with tapestries or wooden panels. The floor may be covered with rushes or other materials. During winter, the fireplace becomes the heart of the room. The stone walls are cold. The fire provides warmth. People gather close. Voices echo through the hall. And outside, the wind moves across the dark countryside. A medieval feast. On special occasions, the castle could become surprisingly lively. Tables were covered with food, bread, meat, cheese, vegetables, fruit, fish, and sometimes expensive imported spices. Large pieces of meat could be roasted over an open fire. Musicians might perform. Guests could talk, laugh, and drink. But medieval feasts weren't simply about eating. They demonstrated wealth. A powerful lord wanted his guests to see that his household could provide enormous quantities of food. Generosity was connected to status. A great feast could strengthen political relationships. The castle kitchen. Behind the scenes, the kitchen workers faced enormous challenges. Imagine preparing food for dozens or hundreds of people without refrigerators, without electric ovens, without modern stoves. Everything depended on fire. Large pots hung over flames. Bread was baked in stone or clay ovens. Meat was roasted on spits. Food had to be preserved using methods such as salting, smoking, drying, or pickling. The kitchen could become one of the busiest places in the castle. Hot, smoky, loud, and constantly active. The castle walls. The most important feature of the castle was its defenses. Stone walls could be several meters thick. Towers provided elevated positions for guards. Archers could fire from protected openings. A moat could make approaching the walls more difficult. The main gate was often the most heavily defended point. Some castles also used drawbridges, allowing the entrance to be raised during an attack. The entire design was intended to slow down an enemy. A medieval castle wasn't necessarily impossible to capture, but it could make an attack extremely difficult. Siege warfare. If an enemy army arrived, the castle could become a fortress. The defenders might close the gates, raise the drawbridge, and prepare supplies. An attacking army could surround the castle, but instead of immediately storming the walls, they might wait. This was a siege. The attackers could attempt to cut off food and water. They might build siege towers, use large machines to throw stones, dig beneath walls, or try to break the gates. For the defenders, time was their greatest ally. If they had enough food, water, and ammunition, they could sometimes hold out for weeks or even months. The castle, therefore, wasn't simply protecting people. It was buying them time, the life of a peasant. But while nobles lived inside castles, most medieval people remained outside. The relationship between them was complicated. Peasants worked the land. They might owe part of their harvest, labor, or various payments to the lord. In return, they received access to land and some level of protection. The exact arrangement varied enormously across Europe and across centuries. Some peasants were relatively independent. Others were tied more closely to the land through serfdom. A serf was not the same as a slave. Serfs generally had legal rights, families, and certain protections. But their freedom to leave the estate could be restricted. Their lives were deeply connected to the manor. The manor. The manor was essentially a local economic system. It could include fields, a village, a mill, pastures, woodlands, and the lord's residence. Farmers worked different areas. Some land was controlled directly by the lord. Other plots were worked by peasant families. The harvest supported everyone, but the distribution of resources was unequal. The lord received income. The church received religious dues. Peasant families kept part of what they produced. This system could function for generations, but it was also vulnerable. A bad harvest, a war, or disease could destabilize the entire community. The castle at night. Now, imagine the castle after midnight. The great hall has become quiet. The kitchen fire is almost extinguished. Most people are sleeping. Only a few guards remain awake. They walk along the walls, listening to the wind. Beyond the castle, the countryside is almost completely dark. Small village homes glow faintly in the distance. Above them, the stars cover the sky. The castle stands silently against the night. For the people living nearby, it is a symbol of protection. But for enemies, it is a warning. And beyond the castle walls, another group is preparing for a very different kind of life. Young boys are beginning their training. They will learn to ride horses, use weapons, and eventually become warriors. They are entering the world of medieval chivalry, the world of the knight. Long before a young man could become a knight, his training would begin. Imagine a medieval castle at sunrise. The mist still hangs over the fields. Horses move quietly inside the stables. The stone walls are cold from the night. And in the courtyard, a young boy is already awake. He watches experienced warriors practice with swords. He hears the sound of wooden shields striking. Horses stamp their feet against the ground. Metal armor moves with every step. For this boy, the castle is not simply his home. It is his school. His future is being prepared. And one day, he may become a knight. The page. For boys from noble families, training could begin at a surprisingly young age. A child might be sent to another noble household, where he would serve as a page. At first, his responsibilities were not about fighting. He learned manners, household duties, basic riding, religious practices, how to behave around nobles, and how to serve at the dinner table. He was learning the culture of the medieval aristocracy. But slowly, his education became more physical. He learned to handle weapons, he practiced with wooden swords. He learned how to control a horse, and he watched experienced knights carefully. Every skill would eventually matter, becoming a squire. As the boy grew older, he could become a squire. This was a much more serious stage of training. A squire served directly under a knight. He helped maintain weapons, prepared armor, cared for horses, and accompanied his knight during military campaigns. But he was also learning how to fight. Swordsmanship, spear fighting, shield use, archery in some regions, and especially horsemanship. A medieval knight's greatest advantage was often his horse. A trained war horse could be incredibly powerful, and controlling it while wearing heavy equipment, while carrying weapons, required enormous skill. The war horse. Imagine standing beside a medieval war horse. It is large, powerful, and carefully trained. Its muscles move beneath its coat. Its breath creates clouds in the cold morning air. The squire checks its equipment. The saddle is secured. The reins are inspected. The horse's armor may be prepared. Then, the knight approaches. He places one foot into the stirrup, pulls himself upward, and settles onto the horse. Suddenly, the man and the animal become one fighting unit. The horse provides speed. The rider provides weapons and direction. Together, they could cross a battlefield with extraordinary force. Learning to fight. Knightly training wasn't simply about swinging a sword. A warrior had to understand distance, balance, timing, and movement. Training weapons were often used. A wooden sword could help develop technique. A padded shield could allow repeated practice. Young warriors could spar against one another. They learned how to defend, how to attack, and how to remain calm under pressure. The goal was not just strength, it was control. A skilled fighter didn't waste movement. Every action had purpose. The sword. The medieval sword became one of the most recognizable symbols of knighthood. But swords were expensive. A good sword required skilled metalworking. Iron and steel had to be shaped, heated, and carefully worked. The blade needed to be strong, but not so brittle that it would break. The handle had to provide a secure grip. The weapon had to be balanced. For a knight, a sword could be a valuable possession, but it wasn't necessarily his only weapon. The lance. On horseback, the lance could be extremely powerful. A knight could hold a long wooden spear, guide the horse toward an opponent, and use the momentum of the charging animal. This technique became closely associated with medieval tournaments. But battlefield combat was far less romantic. A lance could break, a horse could fall, armor could become damaged, and a rider could be thrown violently to the ground. Medieval warfare was dangerous even for highly trained warriors. The armor. One of the most iconic parts of a knight's equipment was armor. But armor changed dramatically throughout the Middle Ages. Early medieval warriors often relied on mail armor, interlocking metal rings that protected much of the body. Later, plate armor became increasingly sophisticated. Individual metal plates were designed to protect specific parts of the body. The result could look incredibly heavy, but well-made plate armor distributed its weight across the body. A trained knight could move surprisingly well. He could walk, ride, stand up after falling, and even fight. The image of a knight who could barely move in armor is largely a myth. Putting on the armor. But preparing for battle was still a process. A knight didn't simply pick up his armor and put it on in seconds. Different pieces had to be fitted carefully. First came protective clothing, then mail or padded garments, then the metal plates, arm protection, leg protection, chest armor, gloves, helmet. Each piece had a purpose. The final helmet could dramatically change the knight's view. The world suddenly becomes narrower, sound becomes different, breathing feels warmer. The face disappears behind metal. The knight is no longer simply a man. He has become a warrior. The tournament. Not every knight's day involved war. Tournaments became important events in medieval aristocratic culture. Imagine arriving at a large open field outside a castle. Thousands of people have gathered. Colorful banners hang from wooden structures. Horses move through the crowds. Musicians play. Merchants sell food and goods, and knights prepare for competition. The atmosphere is almost festive, but the games can still be dangerous. Jousting, melee combat, and other martial contests tested skill. For knights, tournaments provided opportunities to demonstrate ability, gain prestige, and sometimes win valuable rewards. For spectators, they were enormous public events. Chivalry. Knights were also associated with an ideal known as chivalry. The concept developed over time, and its meaning varied. It included ideas about loyalty, courage, military behavior, and proper conduct. Literature later transformed knights into romantic heroes. Stories described noble warriors, beautiful castles, great quests, and legendary battles. But reality was more complicated. Knights were still human beings. Some were honorable. Some were ambitious. Some were violent. Some followed ideals. Others ignored them. The medieval world was not a storybook. It was a real society with real people, a knight's castle. A successful knight might eventually receive land. He could manage an estate, collect revenues, and maintain his own household. His castle might be much smaller than a king's fortress, but it could still contain a hall, stable, storage rooms, defensive walls, and living quarters. His responsibilities expanded. He was no longer simply a warrior. He might become a landowner, administrator, and local authority. The sword remained important, but so did the ability to manage people. The reality of war. When war came, knights could spend long periods traveling. Armies moved slowly. Horses needed food. Soldiers needed supplies. Weapons had to be maintained. Weather could make roads almost impossible. And battles were not always enormous clashes between thousands of armored knights. Many medieval conflicts involved raids, ambushes, sieges, and attacks against towns or villages. The castle was often more important than a single battlefield victory. Control the fortress, and you could control the surrounding territory. The knight returns home. Imagine a knight returning to his castle after a long journey. The gates open. The horse walks slowly into the courtyard. Servants approach. The knight removes his helmet. The smell of wood smoke fills the air. His armor is cleaned. His horse is cared for. A meal is prepared. And for the first time in weeks, there is peace. The great hall is warm. The fire is burning. Outside, the countryside is dark. For a moment, there is no battlefield, no enemy, no marching, only silence. But medieval Europe was changing. Cities were growing. Trade routes were expanding. Merchants were becoming more powerful. And new weapons would eventually begin changing warfare itself. The age of the traditional knight would not last forever. But before that happened, another group would transform medieval Europe in a completely different way. They were not soldiers. They were not kings. They were not farmers. They were people who carried knowledge across generations, inside quiet stone buildings, where manuscripts were copied by hand. They were the monks. While knights trained in castle courtyards, and farmers worked beneath the open sky, another world existed behind thick stone walls, a world of silence, prayer, books, gardens, and candlelight. These were the medieval monasteries. Imagine approaching one just before sunrise. The countryside is still dark. Mist rests over the fields. A stone bell tower rises above the monastery walls. Then, a bell rings. Inside, monks slowly wake. The day is beginning. And for many of them, the first hours will be spent in prayer. The monastery. A medieval monastery could feel like a small world of its own. Behind its walls were chapels, dormitories, kitchens, gardens, workshops, storage rooms, and often a library or writing room. The buildings were usually arranged around a central courtyard called a cloister. Stone columns surrounded the open garden. Monks could walk quietly beneath the covered passages, protected from rain and snow. The atmosphere was intentionally peaceful. While the outside world could be noisy and unpredictable, the monastery was designed around routine. Prayer, work, study, rest. Then, the cycle began again. The daily routine. A monk's life was highly structured. The exact schedule varied depending on the religious order and period, but prayer was spread throughout the day. The monastery bell announced the different times. Monks gathered in the church, stood together, and recited prayers or sang religious chants. Then they returned to their tasks. Some worked in gardens, others prepared food, some cared for animals, some made clothing, and others worked with books. The day was not necessarily comfortable. Monastic life required discipline. Silence could be expected for long periods. Personal possessions were often limited, and the community followed strict rules. But monasteries also became centers of learning. The scriptorium. One of the most fascinating rooms in a medieval monastery was the scriptorium. This was where manuscripts could be copied and produced. Imagine entering the room. It is quiet. Wooden desks stand near windows. Small candles provide additional light. Monks sit with sheets of parchment in front of them. A quill moves slowly across the page. There is no printer, no keyboard, no photocopier. Every word has to be written by hand. A single book could require months, or even years, of work, making parchment. Before a manuscript could be written, the writing material had to be prepared. Parchment was made from animal skin. The skin was cleaned, treated, stretched, and carefully prepared. Then it was cut into sheets. The process required skill. Good parchment could be smooth and durable. Poor preparation could leave imperfections. The finished sheets were then folded, arranged, and prepared for writing. Imagine how different this was from opening a blank document on a computer. Every page represented physical labor. The quill. The writing instrument was usually a quill. A feather, often from a goose, was carefully prepared. The tip was cut into shape. Ink was applied. Then, the monk began writing. One mistake could ruin an entire section. There was no simple backspace button. A scribe had to work carefully. The letters had to remain consistent. The lines had to stay straight. Margins had to be maintained. And the text had to be readable. It was slow, patient work. Illuminated manuscripts. Some manuscripts became works of art. Their pages were decorated with elaborate letters, painted illustrations, and intricate borders. These are known as illuminated manuscripts. Gold could be applied to certain designs. Bright pigments created colorful scenes. Animals, plants, mythical creatures, and religious figures could appear around the text. A single decorated page could require enormous artistic skill. These manuscripts were not ordinary books. They were treasures. And because they required so much labor, they were expensive. What knowledge was preserved? Monasteries became important centers for preserving and copying texts. Religious writings were central, but medieval scholars also encountered works inherited from the ancient world. Texts associated with Roman and Greek authors, philosophy, medicine, history, and science could survive through manuscript traditions. Not every ancient book survived. Many were lost. But some survived because generations of scribes continued copying them. This is one reason monasteries are so important to the story of European history. They helped preserve parts of the intellectual heritage of earlier civilizations. The medieval library. A monastery library could contain shelves of handwritten manuscripts. But compared with a modern library, the collection would be tiny. A single book might represent an enormous investment. Books had to be protected from moisture, fire, insects, and careless handling. Some manuscripts were chained or kept in secure storage. A library was therefore a place of great value. Imagine a monk opening a manuscript written centuries earlier and realizing that the words in front of him had been copied repeatedly across generations. He was holding a physical connection to the past. Monks were not all the same. Medieval monks belonged to different religious orders. Some emphasized prayer, others emphasized work. Some became scholars, others focused heavily on agricultural production. Different monasteries developed different traditions. Some became wealthy and powerful. Others remained small and isolated. Monasteries could be found across much of Europe, from quiet countryside valleys to remote mountain regions. They weren't completely disconnected from society. In many places, they interacted with farmers, merchants, local rulers, and travelers. The monastery garden. Step outside the stone buildings, and you'll find another important area: the garden. Monasteries often cultivated vegetables, herbs, fruit, and medicinal plants. Gardens could provide food for the community, but herbs were also important for medieval medicine. Plants such as sage, mint, fennel, and other herbs were cultivated and used in different preparations. The garden, therefore, became both practical and educational. A monk might spend the morning copying a manuscript and the afternoon working among plants. The monastery connected knowledge with daily work. The monastic kitchen. Inside the kitchen, the peaceful atmosphere disappears. Large pots hang over open fires. Bread is being prepared. Vegetables are being chopped. Water is carried in heavy containers. Wood must constantly be supplied. Meals vary depending on religious rules and the calendar. Some periods involve restrictions on certain foods. Fish could become particularly important during fasting periods. The kitchen, therefore, had to carefully manage supplies. And because monasteries could house large communities, feeding everyone was a serious logistical task. The bell returns. As the day continues, the monastery bell rings again. Monks stop what they are doing. They gather for prayer. The sound travels beyond the monastery walls, across fields, through forests, and into nearby villages. For people living in the countryside, the bell becomes part of the landscape. It marks time. It announces religious services, and it reminds everyone that the monastery is there, a place of hospitality. Some monasteries also provided hospitality for travelers. Imagine arriving after a long journey. Your clothes are dusty. Your horse is tired. The road behind you has been difficult. Ahead, you see the stone walls of a monastery. A gate opens. Inside, you may find food, water, and somewhere to rest. For travelers crossing medieval Europe, such places could be extremely valuable. The roads were long, the journey was uncertain, and safe shelter was never guaranteed. The sound of medieval chant. As evening approaches, the monastery becomes quieter. Inside the church, monks gather once again. The only light comes from candles and lamps. The stone walls reflect the sound of their voices. A slow chant fills the room. The melody echoes through the arches. There is no orchestra, no modern sound system, only human voices, stone, and silence. Outside, the countryside is disappearing into darkness. Knowledge in a dangerous world. Medieval Europe was not always peaceful. Wars could destroy towns. Fires could destroy buildings. Political conflicts could change kingdoms. And disease could spread rapidly. A manuscript could disappear forever if a library burned. A monastery could be abandoned. A generation of knowledge could vanish. That made the people who copied and protected books incredibly important. They could not preserve everything. But what survived could influence generations that came later. And eventually, centuries of preserved knowledge would contribute to a major transformation. Europe would begin rediscovering ancient texts, developing universities, expanding trade, and producing new ideas. But before that transformation, medieval Europe would become increasingly connected through one powerful force: trade. Merchants would travel between towns. Ships would cross dangerous seas. Markets would grow. and ordinary villages would gradually become connected to a much larger economic world. The quiet monastery was only one part of medieval Europe. Outside its walls, the roads were becoming busier, and in the growing towns, a new class of people was beginning to change medieval society: the merchants. As the morning mist disappears, the quiet medieval village begins to change. People leave their homes. Carts move along muddy roads. Horses carry sacks of grain. And in the distance, the sound of voices grows louder. Because today is market day. For medieval people, the market is more than a place to buy food. It is where news travels, where strangers meet, where merchants make fortunes, and where a small village can suddenly feel connected to the entire world. The medieval market. Imagine walking into a busy medieval market. Wooden stalls line the street. A baker displays fresh bread. A farmer has baskets of vegetables. A butcher hangs cuts of meat. A leatherworker displays shoes and belts. A blacksmith offers tools. Merchants shout prices. Customers negotiate. Children move through the crowd. Animals wander between the stalls. The smell is overwhelming. Fresh bread, smoke, horses, spices, leather, and cooked food. Everywhere, people are talking. The sounds of the market. Unlike a modern shopping center, the medieval market has no background music. Instead, there is human noise, a merchant calling out to customers, a farmer discussing prices, a blacksmith hammering metal nearby, a horse making noise beside a cart, a child laughing, someone arguing over the price of grain. The market is alive. And for many people, it is one of the few places where they regularly encounter strangers from outside their village. What did people buy? Most ordinary people bought practical goods: grain, bread, vegetables, fish, meat, salt, cloth, shoes, tools, pottery, wooden containers, household objects. A farmer might bring eggs to the market and return home with a tool he couldn't produce himself. A craftsperson might sell shoes, then use the money to purchase food. The market creates exchange, and gradually, that exchange helps towns grow. The rise of medieval towns. As trade expanded, some settlements became permanent towns. Markets attracted people. Craftsmen settled nearby. Merchants built warehouses. Travelers needed inns. Religious buildings appeared. Defensive walls were constructed. And streets became increasingly crowded. A medieval town could be surprisingly busy. Compared with a quiet farming village, it felt like another world. There were narrow streets, wooden houses, stone buildings, shops, workshops, and public spaces. And above everything, the church tower, the narrow streets. Medieval streets were rarely designed according to modern planning. Many were narrow. Buildings could lean toward one another. Upper floors sometimes extended over the street. This created shade, but it also made streets feel enclosed. Rain turned dirt roads into mud. Animals moved through the same spaces as people. Waste disposal was a constant problem, and during crowded market days, moving through town could become difficult. Yet these streets were also full of life. Every doorway could lead to a workshop, a shop, a home, or an inn. The craftsmen. Medieval towns depended heavily on craftsmen. Blacksmiths made tools and weapons. Cobblers made shoes. Tailors made clothing. Carpenters built furniture. Masons worked with stone. Potters created containers. Weavers produced cloth. Each craft required years of experience. A young person could become an apprentice, learning from a master. The apprentice worked, watched, practiced, and slowly developed the skills necessary to become a professional. Eventually, he might become a journeyman, and later, a master craftsman. This system helped preserve specialized knowledge. The guilds. As towns became more developed, craftsmen often organized themselves into guilds. A guild could regulate a particular trade. It might establish standards for quality, control who could practice the craft, and organize training. Guilds also provided social connections. Members could support one another. Rules governed prices, working conditions, and apprenticeships. They could become powerful institutions within medieval towns. For a craftsman, belonging to a guild could provide protection and opportunity, but it also meant following strict rules. The merchant. While craftsmen worked in workshops, merchants traveled. A successful merchant might transport goods between several towns, or even across international borders. Imagine a merchant preparing for a journey. His wagon is loaded, cloth is packed carefully, spices are stored in containers, metal goods are secured, the horses are checked, and the road ahead could stretch hundreds of kilometers. There are no paved highways, no GPS, no roadside service stations. The journey could take weeks. And there were dangers. The medieval road. A medieval road could be rough. In summer, dust covered everything. After heavy rain, the same road could become deep mud. Bridges could be damaged. Rivers had to be crossed. Forests could stretch for kilometers. Mountain passes could be dangerous. And travelers could encounter bandits. Merchants, therefore, often traveled in groups. The larger the caravan, the more protection it could provide. A journey was not simply transportation. It was an adventure into uncertainty. The medieval inn. After traveling all day, a merchant might finally reach a town. The first priority was shelter. An inn could provide food, water, a bed, and somewhere to keep the horses. Inside, the atmosphere could be lively. Travelers from different regions sat together. Merchants discussed prices. Pilgrims shared stories. Local people listened to news from distant places. The inn became a kind of information network. Long before newspapers, people learned about the outside world through travelers, spices from far away. Some of the most valuable medieval goods traveled enormous distances. Spices were particularly valuable. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other exotic products could travel through complex trade networks. They might pass through many different hands before reaching a European market. Why were they so valuable? They were difficult to obtain. They traveled from distant regions. Transportation was slow, and demand was high. For wealthy households, spices could become symbols of status. A meal containing rare spices demonstrated wealth. The Hanseatic world. In Northern Europe, merchant cities developed powerful trading networks. The Hanseatic League connected numerous towns around the Baltic and North Sea regions. Merchants traded goods such as timber, grain, fish, furs, salt, and other products. Ships moved between ports. Warehouses filled with merchandise. And coastal cities became important centers of commerce. Trade was transforming medieval Europe. Medieval ships. Now imagine standing beside a medieval harbor. Wooden ships rest on the water. Sailors load barrels. Ropes stretch across the deck. Merchants inspect their cargo. The wind fills the sails. A ship slowly moves away from the harbor. The journey could be dangerous. Storms could destroy vessels. Navigation was difficult. Pirates could attack. And sailors might spend weeks at sea. But the rewards could be enormous. A successful journey could transform a merchant's wealth, money, and trade. Coins became increasingly important as medieval economies developed. Different kingdoms produced different currencies. Merchants had to understand exchange rates. Weights and measurements varied. Trust mattered. Contracts became important. Records had to be kept. And financial systems became increasingly sophisticated. The medieval economy was not simply based on barter. Money, credit, loans, and commercial agreements played growing roles. In major trading centers, financial activity could become extremely complex. The medieval fair. Some markets were much larger than ordinary weekly markets. They became great fairs. Imagine arriving at one. Hundreds of merchants have gathered. Temporary stalls stretch across the town. Travelers have arrived from distant regions. Animals, cloth, metal, food, and luxury goods are everywhere. Musicians perform. Food is cooked over open fires. People negotiate. News spreads, and for several days, the town becomes the center of a much larger world, a changing Europe. Trade was doing more than making merchants wealthy. It was changing society. Towns grew. New jobs appeared. Merchants gained influence. Craftsmen became organized. Roads improved in important areas. Ports expanded. And rulers realized that prosperous towns could generate valuable taxes. The medieval world was becoming more connected. A piece of cloth made in one region could be sold hundreds of kilometers away. Salt from one coast could reach inland communities. Grain could move between regions, and information traveled with the merchants. The world was getting smaller. Night in the medieval town. As evening arrives, the market begins to disappear. Stalls are packed away. Animals are moved indoors. Merchants count their coins. Shopkeepers close wooden shutters. The streets become quieter. Torches begin appearing. Inside an inn, travelers continue talking. Someone has arrived from another kingdom. He brings stories of a distant war. Another merchant discusses a new trade route. A sailor describes a storm at sea. The medieval town is quieting, but information continues moving. And beyond the town walls, another world waits. A world of kings, armies, and enormous political struggles. Because medieval Europe was not always peaceful. Kingdoms fought over land. Nobles rebelled against kings. Armies marched across borders. And some of the greatest medieval battles would involve thousands of soldiers. But before we enter those battlefields, we need to understand one of the most important weapons in medieval society. Not a sword, not a castle, not even a knight. It was the longbow, a weapon that could change the balance of power on a battlefield. For centuries, medieval Europe had been changing. Small villages became towns. Wooden fortifications became enormous stone castles. Merchants connected distant regions. Knights became symbols of military power. Monasteries preserved knowledge, and kingdoms slowly became stronger. But the medieval world was never meant to remain unchanged. New weapons appeared. New ideas spread. Cities became wealthier. Trade expanded across continents. And one by one, the foundations of medieval Europe began to transform. The Middle Ages were approaching their final chapter. The battlefield changes. For centuries, the mounted knight had been one of the most powerful warriors in Europe. A heavily armored rider, charging across a battlefield, could be terrifying. But warfare was changing. Infantry became increasingly important. Armies became larger. Crossbows became widespread. And eventually, gunpowder weapons began appearing in European warfare. The sound of a cannon could echo across a battlefield. Stone walls that had once seemed almost impossible to destroy could now be damaged by powerful artillery. The castle was losing its greatest advantage. Its thick walls were no longer enough. The age of the traditional medieval fortress was beginning to fade. The longbow. But before gunpowder transformed warfare, another weapon had already demonstrated how vulnerable armored warriors could become. The longbow. In the hands of a highly trained archer, a powerful bow could launch arrows over considerable distances. English armies famously used large numbers of longbowmen during conflicts such as the 100 Years' War. At battles like Agincourt, archers played a major role. Imagine the battlefield. Thousands of soldiers. Mud beneath their feet. Banners moving in the wind. Armored knights advancing slowly. Then, a command. Hundreds of bows rise. The strings pull back. And suddenly, the sky fills with arrows. The battlefield had changed. The 100 Years' War. One of medieval Europe's longest conflicts was the 100 Years' War between England and France. Despite its name, it wasn't one continuous war. It consisted of multiple periods of fighting spread across more than a century. Kings fought over territory, political claims, and power. Armies crossed France. Castles were attacked. Towns changed hands. And ordinary people often suffered the consequences. Fields could be destroyed. Villages could be burned. Trade could be interrupted. War was never experienced only by soldiers. It reached into everyday life. The Black Death. Then, in the 14th century, Europe faced an even greater catastrophe, the Black Death. The disease spread rapidly across Europe. Cities became crowded with fear. Villages lost enormous portions of their populations. Families disappeared. Fields were left without workers. Trade was disrupted. The psychological impact was enormous. For medieval people, disease could feel mysterious and terrifying. Medicine had limited ability to understand what was happening. People searched for explanations. Some turned toward religion. Others blamed outsiders. Communities were devastated. The population decline changed European society in profound ways. The medieval castle falls silent. Imagine returning to the castle we visited earlier. Centuries have passed. The Great Hall is quieter. The old knightly traditions are changing. Gunpowder weapons have made massive stone walls less secure. Kings are building stronger centralized states. Professional soldiers are becoming more important. The castle still stands, but its role has changed. Some castles become palaces. Others become military ruins. Some are abandoned. Grass grows across the courtyard. The wooden gates slowly decay. The stone walls remain, but the people who once filled them are gone. The village remains. Yet outside the castle, something familiar continues. The fields still stretch across the countryside. Farmers still plant crops. Animals still graze. Villages still gather around churches. People still depend on the seasons. The medieval world doesn't disappear completely. It transforms. Old traditions survive inside a new age. And this is perhaps the most important thing to remember. History doesn't usually change like a door suddenly closing. One world slowly becomes another. 1,000 years. The Middle Ages lasted for roughly 1,000 years. Think about that. 1,000 years of human lives. Millions of births. Millions of deaths. Countless villages. Castles. Wars. Markets, harvests, marriages, journeys, books, songs, prayers, and ordinary days. For the people living through them, their world wasn't called medieval. It was simply home. They woke up. They worked. They ate. They loved. They worried. They raised children. They watched the seasons change. They looked at the stars. And then they grew old. Their lives were ordinary. But together, those ordinary lives created the world we now call medieval Europe. The last night. Now, imagine the final evening of our journey. The sun is disappearing behind a medieval castle. Golden light touches the old stone walls. A village below is becoming quiet. Farmers have returned from the fields. The market stalls have disappeared. The blacksmith's fire has gone dark. Inside a monastery, a final bell rings. Monks gather for evening prayer. In the castle, the great hall is lit by firelight. A few candles flicker. A knight removes his armor after a long day. A merchant closes his shop. A farmer sits beside his family. Outside, the roads become silent. The wind moves through the trees. And above everything, the stars appear, the world they left behind. The people of medieval Europe could never have imagined the world that would eventually follow. They couldn't imagine airplanes, spacecraft, the internet, or cities filled with millions of people. But the modern world still carries pieces of theirs. Many European cities still follow medieval street plans. Old castles still stand on hills. Ancient churches still ring their bells. Universities founded centuries ago continue teaching. Words from medieval languages remain part of modern speech, and traditions developed long ago still influence European culture. The Middle Ages may be gone, but they never completely disappeared. One last look. So, take one final look across the medieval landscape. A castle stands against the horizon. A village rests quietly below. Fields stretch toward a distant forest. A narrow road disappears into the darkness. The church bell has stopped. The market is empty. The monastery is silent. The fire in the great hall slowly fades. And the people who once filled this world, are now part of history. Their buildings remain. Their roads remain. Their books remain. Their stories remain. And sometimes, that is the strangest thing about history. The people themselves are gone, but the world they created still surrounds us. The Middle Ages end. The medieval world did not vanish in a single year. It changed slowly through war, disease, trade, technology, knowledge, and new ideas. The castles became quieter. The knights became less dominant. The cities became larger. Books became easier to produce. The Renaissance began, and Europe stepped into a new chapter. But for roughly 1,000 years, this was the world people called home. A world of stone castles, quiet monasteries, busy markets, muddy roads, golden fields, and enormous night skies. And now, our journey through medieval Europe comes to an end. The castle stands silently beneath the stars. The village sleeps. The monastery is dark. The roads are empty. The fire slowly turns to embers, and the medieval world finally becomes quiet. So, close your eyes. Let the sound of the distant church bell fade. Let the castle disappear into the darkness. Let the old roads, the villages, the forests, and the ancient stars slowly drift away. More than 1,000 years of history have passed before you. But tonight, for a little while, you were there. Good night, and sleep peacefully.